Good morning, everyone, and I send everyone very early Juneteenth greetings. My name is Audrey Davis, and I'm the president of Virginia Africana Associates, a network of museum and preservation professionals dedicated to the accurate interpretation of African American history throughout the Commonwealth. Thank you for attending our third webinar in the Amplifying the Silences of African Americans in Virginia series. Today's webinar focuses on making Reconstruction count, the era of Reconstruction, with our guest speakers, Dr. Edward Ayers and Ms. Annie Evans. A bit of housekeeping before we start. I want to remind everyone that you will be muted during the webinar and to please place any questions that you have in the chat. Before we begin, I would like to thank Virginia Humanities for collaborating with us on this event. Virginia Africana was established under the auspices of Virginia Humanities over 10 years ago. While we became an independent organization in 2016, we value our relationship with Virginia Humanities and its amazing staff, especially Trey Mitchell, who is providing technical support for our webinar today. Virginia Africana looks forward to more years of collaboration with Virginia Humanities. I would now like to introduce to you our moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Laurinette Lee. Dr. Laurinette Lee is our Virginia Africana historian, a University of Richmond professor, and a former board member for Virginia Humanities. It now gives me great pleasure to turn our Zoom podium over to Dr. Laurinette Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Trey, and all of you who are attending this webinar. We thank our guest speakers in advance, but I want to initially reach out to thank the first people. And I thought about my dear late friend, Karen Wood, Dr. Karen Wood, who was also on the board of the Virginia Foundation of Humanities at that time, and became the first director of the Virginia Indian Program at the Virginia Humanities. She passed away in 2019, but she was a well-known poet. And I want to read one of the poems that is particularly apropos today, Apologies. The time has come for the nation to turn a new page by righting wrongs of the past. We apologize for laws and policies that inflicted profound grief, suffering, and loss, and for the removal of children from families, communities, and country. For the pain of these, their descendants, and for families left behind, to mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, for indignity inflicted on a proud people, we say sorry. We resolve that the injustices of the past must never, never happen again, and look to a future based on mutual respect, where all, whatever their origins, are equal partners. That was written by the late Karen Wood. And when we think about those words and think about where we are today, celebrating a new national holiday called Juneteenth, we see how our histories are entwined. Oftentimes, when we think of this hard history, we don't get to the particularities. And so today, what we would like to do is to make sure that we begin to understand the particularities in a moment of American history called Reconstruction. It occurs right after the Civil War. And when we think of Juneteenth, we think about the poetry of Karen Wood and why we are celebrating Juneteenth. I am so delighted to introduce Dr. Ed Ayers and Annie Evans. I've known Ed since the 90s. He was my dissertation director, and we have served on boards and commissions and really have brought to light what it means to be a public historian. He is nationally known, a National Professor of the Year, National Humanities Medal from President Barack Obama, past president of the Organization of American Historians, and Bancroft Prize for Distinguished Writing in American History. He was the founding chair of the board of the American Civil War Museum, executive director of New American History, an online project which you'll learn more about today. And he is the author of Southern Journey, The Migration of the American South. This is the wonderful book that I hope that you will avail yourselves of. This will be helpful for teachers and museum professionals when you think about interpreting our history. And we have Annie Evans. She is Director of Education and Outreach for New American History. She's National Geographic Society Grosvenor Teacher Fellow, Nat Geo Certified Educator and Trainer, co-coordinator of the Virginia Geographic Alliance, and has over 30 years of classroom and educational leadership experience. She facilitates professional learning for K through 16 teachers and museum educators, focusing on historical thinking skills, geoliteracy, instructional coaching, project-based learning, and performance assessments. Hear ye, Ed Ayers and Annie Evans.
Thank you so much, Laurinette. It seems like an auspicious day, Juneteenth, Virginia Humanities, working with Dr. Lee. It reminds me of when Laurinette and I were working on the future Richmond's past, trying to acknowledge the Civil War and emancipation and the former capital of the Confederacy, which seems like a million years ago now. We started that in 2009 and 10. And I remember a frequent talking point that I made that always had a great impact that I'm going to have to remove from my speeches now. I would say, can you imagine that we don't have a national holiday for the most important thing that's ever happened in this country, which is the end of perpetual bondage for 4 million people? Now we do have that. And it reminds us both of the weight of the past, but also that history changes. It also seemed in 2010 that the monuments on Monument Avenue would always be there. So history moves slowly and then suddenly moves rapidly. And what we're trying to do with New American History, as we'll show you today, is offer resources for us to get our bearings as history is moving around us. History, as you know, is much debated right now. Both Annie and I have been involved in the African American History Education Commission for the Department of Education for Virginia, and we're involved now in writing new standards of learning for Virginia. While much of the rest of the country seems to be going backward in its confrontation with the complexity and inhumanity of our past, Virginia is moving forward. So we feel lucky to be in Virginia. We feel lucky to be with you today. We look forward to having a conversation. So we're going to show you some things with some dispatch so that we can have conversations about them along the way. Reconstruction is tough. You know, I've taught the 19th century American South for, 40 years now. And I found that as I try to teach this, that it's been hard to teach in previous years of education. And so people aren't exactly sure what to think of it when they come to the college classroom. I had my students at University of Richmond go online at the beginning of a class, and I said, what do Americans think about Reconstruction? And what they think about Reconstruction, the students came back and reported over and over again, is that it was a failure. And we know why people say it was a failure. We know about the violence, the injustice, the brutality, the broken promises. But if we look at it from the perspective of what the freed people themselves were able to seize from Reconstruction, there's more to the story than we've been taught to understand. You know, I joke that Reconstruction is hard to understand in part because it happens over winter break between the fall and the spring semesters. It happens between volume 1 and volume 2. And the fact that it's labeled a failure means that it doesn't fit into the usual ways that American history is taught in our schools, which is a story of unfolding progress. We don't really know what to do with Reconstruction. What we should think about, of course, is that it was the greatest experiment in the actual implementation of democracy in American history, and really one of the greatest in world history. No other of the societies that had suffered slavery underwent something like Reconstruction in the 19th century. Such a bold and broad, ambitious act of democratization. We want to embrace that. We need to acknowledge its successes. We need to acknowledge its sources. We need to acknowledge its inspiration. So some of the things that we're going to show you today are designed to do that. As Larnette said, to make it more concrete, to make it more human, to make it more compelling. So I'm going to begin by just giving you a brief overview of what New American History is. It's a series of an alignment of a whole set of tools to enable teachers especially to see and teach American history in a more compelling way than our usual textbooks, multiple choice tests, and all the different elements of standardized teaching do. So Annie has shown you, and this is the way it's going to work, you're going to hear me refer to Annie. Annie knows what I don't know, which is actually how to teach in the K-12 classrooms. I've been in the other side of that artificial divide between K-12 and higher education for all these years. And we launched out on New American History. I knew I needed a veteran and I needed somebody who had the credibility with her fellow teachers. And I've been so lucky to find that in Annie. So what you're seeing here is New American History, which is the place every month that we present a new edition of a kind of a suite of the resources that we have. This has an essay that I wrote in response to the attacks on so-called critical race theory that's being launched in states across the country, and pointing out how misguided that effort is, that the very idea of intruding these political purposes on the classroom violates the basic principle of history teaching, which is creating a community of trust in the classroom. If we can't talk about the hardest things in American history in our classrooms, where are we supposed to talk about them? And if we don't trust the people who teach history for a living to teach history, who will we trust? So we advocate for the autonomy and integrity of history education, but we also try to provide tools that are nonpartisan, that are free, that are not behind some paywall, that don't ask anything of you. We're not going to try to swamp you with spam later. And we respect the teachers who know how to do this. That's the basic idea behind New American History. What if we gave you tools that you don't have time to create on your own and that you can share and build upon? And as we'll see, that Annie will give you tips on how to use them, but to make them freely available. Obviously, the pandemic showed why it's important to have online resources, but we know that this is going to be important even as we come back together. So that's what New American History is. It has a whole set of resources. One that I'm very proud of is Backstory, which was the national radio show and podcast that Virginia Humanities created and hosted for 12 years. And that I had the good fortune of being able to be one of the hosts for. And we've gone through Backstory and made it even more adaptable to classroom use so that you can play segments. You don't have to hear my bad jokes, or not all of my bad jokes, but that to show how you can use audio to engage students who might not be as engaged by reading. And you'll see that we also use other media of video, also of maps, also of that interactivity, all the different ways of engaging the past. So a key part of New American History is bunk. And that's named after the Henry Ford quote that history is more or less bunk. The only history that matters is the history we make today, he said. Well, what bunk shows is that history is being made every day. American history is being presented in all kinds of media all the time, often not labeled as what we think of as history, which our students think of as that stuff in that big homogenized textbook. Instead, what we're trying to show people is that history is all around us. It's alive, and it matters to every single decision that you make about your social life. So one of the things that we can do, and it's just showing you that here are the articles just about Juneteenth today, and that the history of how Juneteenth came about. So we're documenting the way that it is all, our understanding of the past is constantly changing. And here is how this came about. And Annie, you can maybe go ahead and show us how these different things in Bunk connect with one another. So if you choose an article in Bunk that you find interesting, you'll see there a whole series of tags that connect things together. And so that all these things are tagged so they relate to one another. Go ahead and choose one of your preference, Annie, and we show how these all connect. So there's the Great Migration. You can see here there are 80 articles that is taken from all kinds of publications, all the way from blogs to the New York Times, all the way from across as much as we can the political spectrum. And the whole idea with this is to, it's very interesting. I'll warn you, you go into Bunk, you don't come back out for a long time. There's over probably 6,000 articles there now from over 500 different publications, and all of which are oriented around these tags. So you can follow people, you can follow a core idea, you can follow through time, and each of these stories will trick you into going to the nutter. That's kind of the whole idea, is to show students how it is that history is a living presence in their lives. It's what I call ambient history. So Annie, do we talk about Reconstruction in Bunk? So she's going to type in Reconstruction. I'm guessing that we do, and you can see there all.
We definitely do.
278 articles about this. So Annie, would you like to talk a little bit about how it is that Bunk works and how it is that you are sort of harnessing this power for students and teachers?
I definitely would. So when Ed first showed me Bunk, for the teachers in the audience, of course, I spent hours that night. I was completely mesmerized. And it's a tool that every day I still am uncovering new ways to use it. And I think for the teachers in the audience, and I know some of you are with us, one of my favorite ways to do is just to let the kids go in and explore. I think it's really important that we don't pin them into only reading certain things that we've picked. It's really important to give them some time for exploration. And so giving them a topic such as Reconstruction is great, but then kind of give them a little time at the beginning to discover and explore things on their own. I think that's very important. As they're exploring, they can add content to what we call a collection. And I'll kind of show you as we add a few more things. They can take notes here, and they can save those notes on different articles or excerpts or pieces of content that they look at. And as Ed said, there are different ways. They can look for articles that have the same idea. If they find one that they find very compelling, or you may ask them, find a connection that you're interested in sharing with your neighbor or with the class, you can actually hit this little button down here. And a lot of people miss that. So I wanted to point that out. It gives you a unique URL that you can copy and share, or you might start off with a connection, give that to the students. You can embed that connection into your course, or you could email it, as to a friend, for those of you in the audience that are not teachers. The other thing I'd love to do is have kids explore the tags. And then one activity that actually another teacher emailed me and said, this is what I did with Bunk, so now I've completely stolen that idea. She had the kids make up their own tag. Like, what is another tag that you or a word or something that you find these two articles have in common. So creating their own new tag. And they can actually email that to our bunk editor, Tony. There's a place under the menu where it says, hey, do you have a great resource? So if you find an article that we don't currently have in bunk, or you have a suggestion for a new tag, you can send that, and kids enjoy doing that as well. I'm going to go ahead and tag a couple of other articles here so I can show you the collections feature. And the collections feature actually has a couple of ways that teachers can use it. You can make a collection and push it out as an assignment, especially with younger learners, because we know that a lot of school divisions have email turned off, and it does email you the link. But for older students who are allowed to use email, once they get 2 or 3 articles in their collection, there's a little blue finalize button down here in the bottom right. And they can go in and they can reorder it. They can add a name. They can put their name so you knew who it is that's sending it to you. They can continue their notes. Or if you're pushing as an assignment in this space here, you can put a question that you want them to answer instead of them taking notes. And once you hit complete, it asks for your email, which is why we say with younger students, you see down here where it says submit as an assignment. If you were to make one and push it as an assignment, it sends you a code that the kids would click that box and then they would send it in. So there's a lot of different options for using Bunk. It's a tool that every day I'm finding new ways, or teachers are finding new ways and sharing with me. And so there's the rest of your evening, because you will be on it for hours.
That's right. And it's meant to be it's a value in schools, but it's also for very much a general adult audience. So, and it's also a way to find out, because it's renewed every day, what are we thinking about Reconstruction right now? How does the fact that there's a national holiday about Juneteenth reframe our idea of what Reconstruction was? And it will. It's going to people are going to understand now, oh, this is about liberation, and it's about self-determination, and it's about Black people choosing their own holidays rather than just what Andrew Johnson did or didn't do in Washington, D.C. Okay, let's look at another tool, Annie. Let's look at American Panorama. So the idea of American Panorama is a digital atlas of American history. And the notion is that there's lots of things that we can see on a map that we can't see anywhere else. And part of the idea, one of my sayings about this, is that I want every 7th grade girl in American history to be able to see herself in American history. These are made at the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond, and they are just remarkably beautiful maps that are prize winning. There's one that we won't talk about today on redlining that's been used, well, in the New York Times and all over the United States. But we're going to focus on the 19th century today. That's redlining. It shows the consequences of the past and living in the present. But let's look at forced migration, Annie, because one of the things that's so important to understand about Reconstruction is that it is another stage in the story of African-American people making their own lives. This is a really remarkable map of the domestic slave trade. And you'll see that I adopt this later in a different kind of way in the book that Larnette Connolly mentioned, Southern Journey. But here you can see how every county in the South was involved in the domestic slave trade. And you can see, look at Virginia. Areas that are blue is where the enslaved population is decreasing. And I'm telling you something that you know very well, is that Virginia has been the wellspring for the African-American population across the entire South because of the brutality of the domestic slave trade. This is a way for people to see beyond that generalization to how it changed from one decade to the next, exactly how individual counties were involved in this, where enslaved people went, to be able to see, you can see that blue bar of Virginia, the population loss. But you can also switch over into narratives and read the words of the people who were caught in this domestic slave trade. I'm sure you know that 1 million American people in perpetual bondage were bought and sold across state lines in the domestic slave trade. So we have other maps that show things about Reconstruction as well. And Annie, do you want to go ahead? Do you want to show Southern Journey now, or you want to go to the congressional maps?
I think we are going to the congressional maps next, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, there was one map that's not in the online version that we wanted to kind of show. If you want to explain the hex bins, maybe.
Yeah, I did. So this is these are my maps from the book Southern Journey. It's from 1790 to the present. We'll talk a little bit about some of the later maps a little bit later today, but it's available at the Digital Scholarship Lab through New American History as a story map. Innovative ways of showing this. This is the Black population of the American South, and showing in a more subtle way, this is the creation of the Black Belt and along the Mississippi Delta and the expansion of slavery into Louisiana and into Texas. Areas that are varying shades of gold are shades where the population is growing. Areas that have varying shades of blue, and the brighter the blue are where the population is declining. And if it's black, that's where the population is relatively consistent. So this allows us to see the domestic slave trade, and then, as you'll see, all the other patterns of Black migration when people are choosing where to go themselves in new ways. I think, Annie, we were going to mention the Secession Convention.
Yes, correct.
So one of the things that issue in all of the debates now about critical race theory and the issues of what caused the Civil War. Here in Virginia, we made this tool at the University of Richmond, the 3,000 pages of debates in Richmond as people decided whether or not Virginia should secede or not. And of course, you know, the great romance that people have told, embodied in those statues on Monument Avenue, is that, you know, Virginia seceded for states' rights. Well, if you type in tariff, for example, you find it's only mentioned 70 sometimes. If you type in SLAV asterisk, which is all the different versions of slavery, you'll see it's mentioned 1,432 times. So people need to get over the idea that Virginia seceded for something reason other than slavery. They did use the language of the rights of the states to sustain slavery, but there's no doubt. And so students can look into this for themselves and to see exactly why it is that Virginia left. So that's another tool that we have. What do we have next, Annie?
We go back up to the heat map.
Okay, so the important thing to understand about Reconstruction is it begins during the war itself. This is a heat map from Southern Journey. Areas that are bright red are areas where African-American people came into contact with the United States Army. And you'll see that this is long before emancipation. And this is one way that Juneteenth actually doesn't reflect the experience of most of African-American people and doesn't reflect most of the experience of the South. But it's significant to show how deeply entrenched slavery was that it took until June for word to reach the farthest reaches. From 3 weeks after Virginia's secession, however, the United States Army and African-American people interacted because African-American people made it happen. And all of you know the story of Fort Monroe and the 3 men who go there and declare themselves allies of the United States and are declared contraband of war. Those dramas are played out over and over again, all along the Atlantic coast, but then all along the Mississippi River, all along the Tennessee River. The punchline of all this is that wherever Black people had any promise of an ally, of a way to make themselves free, they seized upon that. And this map is a way of showing how slavery began to end long before the Emancipation Proclamation and independent of whatever decisions were made in Washington. So that's what this heat map shows us. What's the next thing we have, Annie? I'm trying to show all these things so we have plenty of time for discussion.
This is one we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but I did know that there would be some teachers logging in. And there's a terrific article that is linked into the slides that refers to this map and to these documents. And this was an older project that the Scholarship Lab had done on mapping marriage and migration in the Emancipation era. And I just, as a teacher and just as a history person, found it so interesting. And the article that's linked in, hopefully everybody caught the link to the slides. I think it's something that students particularly would be very much interested in. I think students made connections on Loving Day, which was recently celebrated. You know, again, Virginia is so much a part of American history. And I have friends who teach in Caroline County, and they said that this article, like when I shared it with them, that they thought that was very interesting, that, you know, a lot of people in that area don't even realize it, but this actually kind of mapped out other places in Virginia. And we're actually updating this map. So if you go to the map, it's going to say kind of an under construction message, but it will hopefully soon we'll get that back up as we are updating some of our maps. Teachers know that Flash went away, so we're having to recreate some of these wonderful tools. But just being able to go in and read these family stories. And a couple of years ago, we worked with some students. The Loving's daughter, who I think is no longer with us, she came and spoke to some students at the Virginia Film Festival. And a couple of kids said, I don't understand what the big deal is. You know, my mom and dad are two different races and they're married and nobody really cares in our neighborhood anymore. But a little boy stood up and said, but my two moms can't get married. And then all the kids just kind of looked at each other like, oh. And so things that we take for granted now are things that people fought very hard for in the past. And I think having tools like this available where kids can read the real stories of families really hits a core with our students.
And it's important to understand that this is light like a telescope that shines from Reconstruction back into slavery, because we generated these from the marriage records that were created as one of the very first acts, both of the enslaved people themselves and of the Freedmen's Bureau. In the county that I've studied most carefully, Augusta County, over 600 people came forward in the first week that they have the possibility of declaring themselves married in the eyes of the state of Virginia, even though they've always been married in the eyes of themselves and of God. And so this is a way to show how the Reconstruction moment can help us understand the generations of slavery that came before. So it's another reason that Reconstruction is at the pivot of slavery and of freedom, and allows us to see in both directions. So the next project is one that I think will be particularly useful to you. This is something else we created at the University of Richmond. We took the Richmond Dispatch and went through and had the students transcribe all the articles about Reconstruction. So people don't know, I can tell you from having speaking around the country, that there was presidential Reconstruction and then congressional Reconstruction. They don't know that there's 2 years passes from the end of the Civil War, from Juneteenth, to the actual implementation of what we think of as Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, writing new constitutions. By following the story day by day on Reconstructing Virginia, you can actually see how the story unfolds. And he's showing you the word cloud and all these different kinds of things that are, I'm not sure why we're seeing that right now, but it's a way of breaking down the historical record to see how it was unfolding day by day. Now, the deficiency of this project, of course, is that it's written from the viewpoint of the white newspaper. And so we really have to tell students, okay, this is not the truth. This is the way that white people were telling the story. On the other hand, it does tell the story of the creation of the new Constitution in 1868, in which they did radical things like create the first public school system in Virginia, and shows the controversy surrounding Reconstruction. It makes it, as Laurinette said, more real and concrete. Let's look at the next project, Annie, which I'm assuming is, actually it's not. Do we have, later we will see Black Virginia.
I believe it's electing, yeah, we'll see that one a little later. I think right now we have electing the House.
Okay, and I'm going fast because I want to be sure. Matter of fact, I'm going to pause.
Okay.
Lauren, are there questions that you'd like to ask us right now before we continue through the rest of the presentation? I'm going to take the brief silence as no and continue, but Laurinette knows that she can interrupt me at any time, and we'll do this. So here's another way, one thing we do know is that Reconstruction is political. And so one of the things that we're showing in the American Panorama are the maps right now of every congressional election from 1840 to the present, and soon this fall of every presidential election. As you can see, we go down to the congressional district level for all of these elections, and that you can toggle back and forth between this reflects population. If you switch over to the map view, Annie, you can see what you would recognize as the maps from the election night. And this has all the sophistication of anything you're going to see on CNN on election night. What this means is that your students or you can follow how it is that all the congressional districts in Virginia voted and changed over Reconstruction. Now, as you know, the whole point of Reconstruction is for Black men to be able to vote for delegates to a new constitutional convention for which they can also be delegates. And you can see how Reconstruction doesn't take place in big red and blue state level, but Republicans driven by Black voters hold on to power as long as they can, anywhere they can. So you can see that the districts there in the lower South where Black men are able to hold on to power much longer. As you can also understand how it is, I'm from the only congressional district in the South that has voted Republican since 1865 or 1867, which is the East Tennessee, which is Appalachia, which is where Andrew Johnson is from. So, but interesting to think about what we think of now as a part of the country that's most opposed to voting extension and so forth would have been allies in the Republican Party of the great democratic experiment. So here's a way to see the politics of Reconstruction in a new way. Now, let's go back to Southern Journey, because one of the things that we really want to understand here is the way that Black people decided their own futures. So one of the very first things after reuniting their families as much as they can, and then declaring their marriages and creating their own churches and creating their own schools, is that they begin to move to places where they might possibly have a chance at creating a life. And here's a great paradox. This is actually 1890, 1900. This is going to be a pattern that we're going to see across the entire post-emancipation era, is that Black Southerners, who are not really welcome in the rest of the United States, and so the great majority of Black migration until the Great Migration is in the South, head farther south. But look at Virginia. Black people are abandoning Virginia, both to go to Philadelphia and Boston, New York, but also to go, and it seems counterintuitive to us, to Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Why? Because that is a place where if you're going to be a sharecropper and you get half the crop, you'd much rather have half a large crop on the rich lands of the Deep South than you would on whatever the worn out soil of Virginia can grow. So there's really little opportunity. So this shows you the hot areas where Black migration is. This is also showing you the cities, that New Orleans, Memphis are places where Black people are moving. But as we think about Virginia history, there's been a great diaspora out of Virginia, both under slavery and then under freedom for entirely different reasons. Okay, what's the next map here, Annie? Next slide.
We're going to go to Black Virginia.
So, I said before that the Richmond Dispatch is white voices commenting on Reconstruction, but we've made another project from the Richmond Planet. Now, it doesn't exist during the years of Reconstruction, but it's dealing with the history that follows Reconstruction. Many of you know John Mitchell. If you've driven down Broad Street, you've seen the riveting portrait of him there next to Maggie Walker looking at you as you drive down Broad Street. This is the Black voice of Virginia and of the whole South. And this is transcription of all of these very many articles that detail every aspect of Black life in Richmond and in Virginia and beyond. And John Mitchell says the monument to Robert E. Lee is a monument to treason. He's also a determined foe of lynching. He is an astute commentator on all the politics of the era. He's a booster of the Order of True Reformers and other efforts of Black self-help. So it's important for your students to read this. I ask my students, what can you tell me about Black life from your textbooks that happened between the end of Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement? And they say, Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois argued with each other. Okay, that's what's featured in our textbooks. This story, this website, Black Virginia, shows that story in its 3 dimensions with all the names of the people who are getting married and who are creating their own churches and organizations and who are resisting segregation. In 1904, there's a protest against segregated streetcars in Richmond there, and John Mitchell and Maggie Walker are allies in that. So Black Virginia, that website, and these, of course, are also all free, are projects that we've made to actually give voice. Now, the Richmond Planet is great to read, but it's hard to read online. So these have all been typed, so they're all searchable and everything. So that's another point. If Reconstruction begins before the Civil War and then accelerates during the Civil War because of the actions of Black people themselves, the consequences of Reconstruction never stop. They're flowing out actually to today because Juneteenth is a consequence of the unfolding power of Reconstruction. And what's our next?
Well,
Yes.
real quick, I was just going to say to the teachers in the audience and also to the parents and grandparents, lynching was not even a topic that was mentioned or explored in the previous standards. And it has now been added as what we call technical edits. We're going to talk about those a little later, but this is a tremendous resource, this and the one that we looked at a few moments ago on Reconstruction, because all these new topics that teachers are now going to be teaching and exploring and developing lessons for over the summer, they're right there for you. They're already here, they're accessible, they're free, you can embed them into your courses. And so I just want to kind of front load that some of these new topics are embedded here, right here, ready for you to go. And again, letting your students explore them rather than us saying, read this and then think this, and then here's the right answer. Let the kids find them. Let them have some time to explore both of those sites. Because like Bunk, once they get started, they're going to be more and more curious. They're going to want to learn more, and they'll probably end up reading a lot more than if you just assigned them or gave them a worksheet or something, right? We all know that. So letting the kids explore often leads to them digging into a topic far greater amount of time and with more passion because they feel like they had a little bit of a say-so on what it is that they're learning and how they're learning it.
Yeah, they're seeing things for the first time. This site was designed by freshmen at UR. I said, you're teaching this for yourself 18 months ago when you were 11th grader in high school. What should it look like? And they said, well, we need to entice people in with random articles, with these word clouds, with these images, and to make it as simple, put no obstacles between just exploration. He says, we never read the instructions, we're going to explore. So this was built by young people for young people. So what Annie says is exactly right. You know, the kind of processed statements that we have in so much of our textbooks and things that people are reading 10th or 15th hand are not nearly as compelling as seeing just some raw article that is a challenge to understand. So that's the whole idea of New American History is, what if we made history interesting? And what if we made it appealing in the medium that they know, the digital world? All of these things work on your phone, on students' phones. And so that this is all designed to be as accessible as possible. That doesn't require them to be in the classroom to do it. You know, one of the things that we've been talking about in our editorials and so forth is that students are going to learn about all these things one way or another. Do you want to keep them out of the classroom so we never talk about them there? So we're trying to build bridges into that way. Another way that we're building bridges is something Laura Nett and I worked on, which was the Monument Avenue Commission. And that's going to be changing a great deal coming up soon. The Supreme Court of Virginia is deciding whether the Lee Monument can come down or not. I will shamelessly say that my daughter and son-in-law have a film coming out, debuting in Maymont on June 23rd, called How the Monuments Came Down, that you're going to want to see. It was canceled because of storm last week, so you have a second chance. And it's going to tell the story of Monument Avenue. So on Monument Avenue is all the kind of things that your students will want to understand. Well, where do these things come from? Who put them up? Why? What did they say when they did? And now they'll be able to understand how they came down. I see Dr. Lee appearing on my screen. I take that as an indication that she would like to say something. And I hand the microphone to her.
Thank you so much, Ed and Annie. This is just what we needed. And as I was listening to you, I thought about those who are in the museums and the curatorial process. Oftentimes curators, the way that exhibits have happened, there is a curator who oversees the process. But what I would like to see, and I think many museums are moving toward this, is having more involvement from the community about the exhibitions that are curated and produced. And so I recall the exhibit on Reconstruction back in the late 90s, American Reconstruction, People and Politics After Civil War, that was organized by the Virginia Historical Society. Eric Fauner was one of the curators there. And I think about the way that history has been taught, particularly Reconstruction. These tools offer an opportunity to teach Reconstruction from a broader perspective, not only to teach it, but to help museum professionals curate the era in a much more broad way. What if you have a curatorial team who pulls articles and primary sources from the various resources that you've mentioned here, to create a reading group and thereby make that exhibit much more expansive in its perspective? Is that a possibility?
It is. I'm going to ask Annie. Annie's actively involved. I mean, I've just been at a committee meeting this morning about the Civil War Museum, and we're running programs all summer long about, I'm lecturing about emancipation and there as well. And we're making a 12-minute film that's going to be the experience when you come into the theater that's featuring African-American life. Is the center of the story, or Black people, the one film that we're going to have. So we're working on all that right now with Stephanie Arduini at the Civil War Museum. But Annie's part of a consortium of working with museums. And maybe you could talk about that, Annie.
Sure. And so as we mentioned, along with changing the standards, we don't ever want to put our teachers in a position where we say, okay, now you have to teach all these new things that you possibly yourself did not learn or did not learn about correctly, right? So part of the legislation, in addition to changing the standards and what it is that we're teaching and how we're teaching them, was also that all Virginia teachers are now going to be given an opportunity to take a course that's in the process of being developed by the Department of Education, along with several universities and museum folks. But while that course is being developed, a group of museum educators, social studies coordinators, which is my previous role before I started working with Ed at New American History, folks from the DOE. So all of us got together the moment that those new standards that those technical edits were adopted. And we immediately said, what do we already have? What is the great content to teach difficult topics like lynching, or to better teach Reconstruction? And so we crowdsourced a list and put that out immediately to all the schools. And then we looked at where are the areas that we are now required to teach where we don't have great content. And between October and March, we put together, I call it a little, boot camp, so to speak. We had teachers pairing up with museums, social studies coordinators pairing up with museum educators, creating new content, digital content, which now lives on a site called Go Open Virginia. It's an open resource center that every teacher in the state has access to, and many other states have similar platforms, and we share between the states now as well. So this work has really solidified or built even more bridges between the museum educators and the classroom teachers and the division level social studies coordinators. That's been one of the best parts of this whole process. So we have historians like Ed and Dr. Alexander lending their expertise. We have content and curriculum specialists like myself and my colleagues saying, okay, how do we break this down? What is it that we need? And then we have teachers and coordinators and museum folks and historians coming together to create original resources or finding ones, Lornette, like you mentioned. We've had some great exhibits. Some of that content still lives digitally, but putting it all in one place so teachers don't have to spend hours hunting for it was essential. And so I'm very excited. We have a slide a little bit later, and there are links in the deck that I provided in the chat that can get you to all of those great resources.
So I'd like to talk about one more thing, and then I like to have what questions people might have. Okay, Lornette? This is what I want to talk about. Annie guessed what it was that I wanted to talk about. This is a remarkable podcast series. I will say I'm executive producer for it, but Kadada Williams is the host, and it is produced by Virginia Public Media, VPM, right here in Virginia, that tells the story of emancipation and Reconstruction from the Black point of view, and with the voices of the actual documents at the time of what it was like to make yourself free, to seize freedom. And the sound design, the actors, the research behind it, phenomenal. And so this is, where you get your podcast, this is available. And this is another way that Virginia is leading, and that VPM, who funded the film about the monuments as well, and also Future of America's Past, we've got great allies here in Virginia, but everybody needs to listen to this. This will blow you away. It's so touching and powerful, and your students are going to find it very effective as well. So, and we're partners. So one thing we've not shown, but I'm not going to actually let her do until we see if there's questions. Annie has crafted learning resources that tie all this together around every kind of subject that's geared toward reading level. I don't know, Annie, maybe you'd want to go ahead and show the learning resource page just to show you how they do that, while I see if Lornette has a question she'd like to pass on.
Sure.
Okay.
And I have heard this podcast. It is very good. It will be very helpful to teachers, museum professionals, parents, students. So I certainly hope that everyone will avail themselves of that. How do you determine the effectiveness of your approach to sharing this history of Reconstruction?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a good one for Annie. I'll start by saying neither of us are big fans of the ways that we would normally assess whether students learn something. We're not much of ones for filling in A, B, C, or D. We're not even much of ones for document-based questions where here are 4 canned documents. See if you can guess what meaning we've hidden into it. You see, our whole idea is exploratory, right? So what's the first indication that we have that we're successful is if students are interested in it and tell their teachers so, if we can. So I care less about, I've been studying this for decades. I still don't know everything about it all. It's not like I've mastered it, right? I know kind of what questions to ask. That's what we want. Are students equipped to go out and ask, to see history for themselves and keep asking questions rather than covering some subject? But Annie, my own explanation is Annie does it through sort of participant observer. She's talking to teachers every single day, but I wouldn't put words in your mouth, Annie. How do you assess the effectiveness of what we're making here?
So what you see on the screen, these are the learning resources that are currently tagged just specifically to Reconstruction, although there are others that touch on it in the scope of a larger related topic. But it's really important that we think about all the different learners that are in our classroom. So part of if we feel like this is being effective, is making sure that we have kind of something for everyone. And so we share with you Seizing Freedom. And so this is a learning resource that we developed for the episode that is specifically talking about education and how families, the moment after emancipation, one of the first things that they thought about was, I want my child to receive an education. And so this episode of Seizing Freedom explores that. This is the teacher view, and it's very important. It looks like, oh, there's so many words, you have to scroll through so much. But to me, it's very, very important that especially novice teachers or pre-service teachers who are going to be student teaching next semester, doing this for the first time, or teachers who say, I'm not sure that I am 100% comfortable teaching all this new content. We embed lots of tips. We kind of pull back the curtain on how we developed this learning resource and all the tools that we used and why we picked certain strategies. All of that's embedded in here, and it's hyperlinked out so you can read more about it to improve your craft as a teacher. There's also a separate student view because kids don't want to scroll through all that. It's important for teachers to know what standard it's aligned to. So we have a completely different view that's just for kids that jumps right into it. Here's some new vocabulary that you're going to see in this learning resource. And then boom, we're right into it. Everything's embedded in there. There's links. So what we find is we field test or pilot these before we put them out on our site. And I know that there are some teachers who are tuning in today who've actually been helping us do this. We've got teachers both from Virginia and in several other states who will give us very good feedback. They're very honest. This was a little challenging for the age group that you thought it might have been for, or the kids didn't really understand this part. Could you explain that a little differently? And then we'll go back and change it and we'll pilot it again. So I think that's all part of our process, so at least the process I've come up with, because I had to do that myself as a teacher. And we're trying to make this as easy for teachers by having everything in one place. You don't have to put 50 different things linked to, a course online. Everything's ready to go. And then getting that honest feedback from students. I also am available to come into classes through Zoom, or if you're in Virginia, I can come live now again and pilot some of these things. And I love listening to the kids as we're giving them that time to explore. I will walk around and jot down, what it is that they're talking amongst themselves about. That's some of the best ways to know if we're hitting the right mark.
So as you can see, we don't make a product and put it out. This is a conversation that we try to start and sustain. Okay, that's not a really good answer to me. What's the next question, Laurinette?
Well, that actually is a very good answer. And when you think about where we are in society today, the unrest, the tension that still exists, it's necessary to have these conversations. And this critical thinking, this way of exploring history and learning together, really gives not only students, teachers, museum professionals, and those who attend museums, it gives us the opportunity to move beyond what we thought we knew and consider the possibilities. When I think about that, though, why has it taken so long for us to get to this point? Why are we just celebrating Juneteenth now? Why are we just beginning to learn about Reconstruction?
I know you know the answer to that question. It's a rhetorical question. A lot of people have a lot of stake in the story of Reconstruction being a failure, that you cannot legislate democracy, that you cannot empower people, that you cannot put possibility within the reach of people who've not had it before. We see the direct, this is very much what's at stake about voting restriction and empowerment today. So we know that the two most popular movies per capita in American history, Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, were both about how Reconstruction was not just a failure, but a travesty. So we've got to overturn not only the amnesia that afflicts us about all history, because that's the way humans are, but also the counter narratives that have told us lies about what Reconstruction was. So That is what we need to do, is to be able to tell new stories about Reconstruction rather than just trying to rebut the old ones. Let's put the people who are at the center of the story in the center of our stories. And those people were people who were making new lives for themselves with nothing but the shirts on their back, with every kind of obstacle that could be put in front of them to make new lives for themselves. That's the story of Reconstruction. And yet the stories we've told have either been the corruption of the Republicans, or in some ways, just the violence against Black people. But what we put Black people at the center of the story and what they did despite that violence. So that's what we're trying to do in all these different media.
And of course, with decentering master narrative or destabilizing, there's going to be pushback. Yep. And that's what we have been experiencing all along here. And so with these tools, we can really fight back and bring Black people to the center again, as you've mentioned. I think for
not just politicians, but mothers who are reconstituting their families, preachers who are creating new churches, right? All those people are as central to Reconstruction as the political leaders that we focused on. There's a whole new generation of thinking about Reconstruction that takes us beyond the political narrative that we knew from back in the 80s. Okay, now let's get down to the ground. As you said at the beginning, Laurinette, let's talk about individual people. That's the great thing about seizing freedom. You're hearing voices that we've never been heard before. And so we're not just revising the story, we're uncovering stories that have been buried all this time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And expanding the story. If I recall a book written by Heather Andrea Williams, Help Me Find My People, the African American Search for Family Lost in Slavery. And that's one of the things that people had not realized, students, teachers, how much Black people were in search of family and the movements that were taking place. And that's why Southern Journeys helps us understand how and why that movement is taking place. I think Belinda has questions coming to us from our attendees now. Belinda?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see, the first question is a little bit off topic, so we may circle back around to that one and go to the second question. How many Virginia teachers are taught about these resources? Is there a systemic way to make sure they know about them?
Annie?
There was an excellent two-day conference this week. That's a great question. Our Department of Education folks, specifically the history and social science coordinators, the history teachers lovingly call them the three history girls, but Christanya Brown and Andrea Emerson and Brandy McCracken put together a series of professional learning this whole past year, knowing that these technical edits were coming into play. We had weekly, we probably had 5 to 8 choices of excellent speakers. We had people from various museums. Ed and I did a few sessions. We had folks from outside the state who were content experts on, culturally relevant pedagogy. And then it culminated in this 2-day conference that was earlier this week. And so as this new course that I mentioned earlier is being developed, we've already started putting some of that professional learning out there for teachers, all of it free. And everything has been recorded, knowing that some teachers were still in the classroom this week and will still be in the classroom next week. We recorded everything, the links to everything, all the slides that we presented and then all of our colleagues presented will go into that Go Open Virginia site that I mentioned earlier. And recordings of all of this will live on the YouTube channel that the DOE has put together. So if you're getting ready to teach about Reconstruction, and there was a great session this past year, you'll be able to pull that up and you can use pieces of that video. Instead of us trying to teach it, let's bring Ed Ayers into the classroom. Let's bring Lauren Lee into the classroom. Let's bring, Hassan Kwame Jeffries into the classroom, because they all came to Virginia through Zoom this year and spoke to teachers. Let them speak to your class, right? Great lectures. We've got a video on demand library. I put together a list of books with Ed's help, and we tried to divide it up between, what could grown-ups, teachers, or just anyone who's listening to this right now, what could you be reading right now for more information? We put together a list for high school students or young, middle school age students, and then even the youngest kids. I think one of the things that we do that's really a disservice to our children is we think, oh, they're too young, they can't handle it. Little kids can handle the truth, and obviously you want to scaffold that in a way that's not going to traumatize them, but you can start planting these seeds just as we did with the standards, making little tweaks to what it is that we teach. It used to say that they talked about people who impacted history or people who were involved in history, including legends. Well, the word legend implies it may or may not be true. So instead, we just changed that one little word to narrative, because a narrative is a real account, just as the narratives that were embedded in the forced migration map, just as the narratives that you'll read in several of the maps that are on that DSL site. These stories have narratives embedded in them. And so there are picture books that our kindergartners and first and second graders can read, or we can read aloud to them, to start letting kids see that all throughout history, people were fighting for this freedom. They were resisting. And afterwards, all of the accomplishments. When we teach Reconstruction as a failure, we're really not teaching kids the full and complete picture. And teachers will say things like, well, the AP curriculum calls it a failure, so I have to call it a failure because it's on the test. My answer to that is, I don't care what's on the test. We need to be teaching the truth. We're in talks with the College Board for folks. We want them to change that. They know how we feel about that, just like we're in talks with the Department of Education about changing the types of assessments. When we teach to a test, as Ed mentioned earlier, we're not really teaching. We're just having kids memorize things, and then we know that they're not going to remember them. So one of the projects that I think it's really important that you guys understand, and parents or grandparents, is we're not just changing what we teach, but we're also going to change how we assess children. And there's been a push for years to move away from these high stakes multiple choice tests to project-based learning and performance assessments, where kids actually do something with the material. They demonstrate what they do know instead of being punished for what they can't memorize. Now you got me fired up.
And today, people, you can, to answer your question too, people can, on this session, can spread the word.
Absolutely.
All right, what's your next question? We're ready.
Great. So this is actually a follow-up that Annie touched on a minute ago. Are there ways to bring some of this to light for younger students who are not skilled at looking at maps and need things to be more concrete, such as pre-K through third grade students?
I am a huge fan of picture books. And just as I said, we don't want to discount the younger kids, I use picture books with older kids. And then as they get a little bit older, the graphic novels, which, when I was a kid, we would think, oh, that's a comic book. My mom would say, oh, why are you reading that? Go read something important. But there's actually a lot we can do. In fact, one of the teachers who's working on summer curriculum with us, he's made almost a whole career out of teaching with comics. So he brings in authors of graphic novels and teaches with those. And I've learned quite a bit from him over the years. And so he's going to be working with us on some new learning resources based on comics and graphic novels and history. And some of those are listed on this resource list that we put together for folks. The March trilogy about Representative John Lewis's life is probably my favorite. But so picture books can be used for older kids. And as the students are getting older, I think those graphic novels are a great way to continue to engage them with reading. They're they're easier for a lot of kids to understand. And the other great trend is, and I think I have it on here, the YA version of Stamped. So a lot of what we consider deeper content books that have come out in the last several years about race or about Reconstruction or about what some people call teaching hard history, although I really don't like that term. they are now making YA versions, young adult versions. And so something that I did with my nieces and nephews last summer was we took the stamped book, and the ones that are already in college or out of college, and their parents read the original, and then the middle and high school kids read the YA version. And then just this past spring, they came out with one for elementary. So now there's 3 levels of that incredible book. So a whole family or a whole community, you could have a K through 12 school system take whichever version you can read on that level and still have a conversation about similar content. That's exciting to me.
That is exciting. Belinda?
Okay, the next one. Are there organizations like New American History or other organizations that can develop guides or toolkits for current teachers who may face pushback from parents who are hearing disinformation about critical race theory and want to ban discussions in classrooms?
I would say that we are, in New American History, trying to create resources that depoliticize the conversation. At the same time, we're empowering people to talk about things like systemic racism, right? So you'll notice that we don't label things hard history or whatever, right? We're just doing it. And so our thinking is that if we wait, and the other thing that we're doing is this goes directly to teachers and students. If we have to run the gauntlet of every school division and school board and all of that, you know, in the way that textbooks or whatever, you can't do it. Instead, we're empowering students to discover things for themselves. It's not we're not trying to trick anybody. We're very obvious. The title of New American History suggests what it is that we're doing. But we believe that this is a desperate moment in American history, and that people are realizing how important history is. But rather than just arguing about it, we're trying to do something about it. And to use these new media, and free, this is all paid for by supporters of the University of Richmond, I should say, in a kind of ad that we're able to do all this. That's our solution. Let's trust teachers. Let's give them the resources to teach this effectively. And at the same time, I'm writing op-eds saying all this stuff about trying to politicize history, attacking 1619 project, 1776 project. So it's pretty clear, you know, what we think. But in the meantime, we're acting instead of just railing against it. So that's our solution. I'm going to give shorter answers now so we can get through more of your questions. All right.
Okay, this is the one that was a little bit off topic, and I thought we'd circle back around if we had time. It looks like we do. Most neo-Confederates are not interested in scholarship, but these symbols like generic monuments of Southern soldiers have to go. How can average citizen induce their local governments to rid public spaces of these racist anathema?
So these are the conversations that I've been in for the last 10 years. And frankly, as a white person, I can enter into conversations about this that people of color can't. And also I have a Southern accent you can hear. And so the people might not, but my job is to persuade them that these are an inappropriate use of shared public space. And I found in all the conversations that Laura Nett and I were in on the museum, on the Monument Avenue Commission, people would say, well, Dr. Ayers, what do you think? And I said, I'm a civil servant right now. You tell me what you think and I'll argue with you. and I would try to persuade people. So I found a couple of things that would work. So people would tell me how great Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were. And Stonewall Jackson was great because he taught Sunday school for enslaved children. And so therefore he couldn't have been racist, and therefore the Civil War could not have been about slavery. And I would say, yeah, what if they had won? And you can just see people had never thought about, oh, yeah, okay. if we take it out of the boxes that these people have put it in, and all the pat explanations that Robert E. Lee didn't even own slaves, which is not true, or Stonewall, all these kind of things, just don't have that conversation again, but rather flip it around and say, if the Confederate States of America had been created, what would have happened? It would have dismembered the United States that you love, I'm sure, and it would have created a brand new nation, the fourth richest economy in the world, based on perpetual bondage. What would that have meant for the course of freedom over the last 150 years? So the short answer, which I promised to give and just didn't, is to reframe the conversation rather than just the slogan against the slogan. Ask people about consequences of things that have happened, because they want to argue, so I was state's witness for the removal of the Lee Monument, and basically got every question that the lost cause could ask me. Well, how about the 3/4 of white men who didn't own slaves, or all these kinds of things? So I think that the people who don't want to change the monuments have a set of stock phrases that they use. We need to reframe the conversations. So that's my answer. But you have to, before you can have conversations, you actually have to have conversations, right? And boy, Larnette can tell you, it requires great patience, right? To get past the knee-jerk things, and I've heard Larnette be so eloquent in so many different occasions. So we have to put ourselves in uncomfortable positions to change people's minds. That's my belief. So it was maybe off topic, but I showed it's actually not. It's exactly, that's what all this is for, is to broaden our understanding of why history matters, that it does things like shape our politics and understanding of today. And if we don't get the story straight, we can't possibly prevail today. If we don't know what we're talking about, you can't persuade people. So I've not read what the chat lines are saying, but I'm seeing chat light up. So I'll see if Belinda, if you want to translate them to Annie and me.
I think that's all we have time for in terms of questions. I know there are a lot of people asking about links to individual resources.
Right.
I know Annie shared a link to the slides, but we may want to just follow up. And I think we have an opportunity to follow up and just share links to some of these resources after the webinar.
Well, we're all about
Everything
sharing
that we
links.
showed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything's in the slides.
But I know Annie is happy to respond to anybody about any question about any particularity, to go back to Larnette's point, because we showed you a lot. That was our strategy today, was just to say, here's a whole array of different ways. Maybe one of these things will appeal to you for the particular work you have before you as a member of the community, or civic leader, or a teacher, or a parent, grandparent. So we know that you couldn't possibly have absorbed all that. And frankly, we just barely scraped the surface. But that was our purpose. And the fact that there are people wanting those, that's how I'm going to assess our success, that they're with us even here in lunchtime. So thank you all very much for having us today.
Thank you so much, Annie. This has been wonderful, because I know about the work that you do, and it is so much, I can't keep up with it. But we're at the heart, we are about telling a more full narrative and making it truly more inclusive than it has been before. And so before Benjamin comes on, let me share with you what I always do: lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. That was written by James Weldon Johnson, was Lift Every Voice and Sing, and about 100 years ago. Those words really resonate today, particularly as we celebrate this new national holiday, Juneteenth. And we thank you all so much for coming to share at this particular time. We had tried to get it earlier, but this is the perfect time to have both you and Annie and Ed. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
It was our honor. And
Absolutely.
we wish you well in your important work. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank Virginia Humanities as well. It's
Indeed.
been a pleasure to be of service. Ed and I just rotated off the board 2 weeks ago today, I believe. But our heart is always in sharing our history. Thank you, Trey. Thank you, Matthew, all of you at the Virginia Humanities. And let us remember the words of Karen Wood. We apologize for all that's gone before. We look toward a brighter future. We look toward Benjamin Ross, our treasurer.
And a very good afternoon to all of our friends, our participants, our guest speakers. We are so appreciative for you joining us today in this continuing series of webinars that Virginia Africana brings to you, and we certainly hope that you have enjoyed it. We want you now to consider supporting Virginia Africana Associates in our work that we do. We have a PayPal account to make it convenient for you to make that contribution, or you may decide to send it directly to our address here in the city of Richmond, Virginia. Both information is available for you in today's program. We also want to extend an invitation to all of you out there if you are interested in joining us as a member of the board of directors of Virginia Africana. We are interested in expanding our board, new ideas, new people from around the state of Virginia. If you are interested in being a part of us on our board, please let us know. We would be more than happy to hear from you and put you to work immediately. Again, thank you so much on this beautiful Saturday afternoon on this new national holiday, Juneteenth. We hope that you will have a great day today, and we look forward to being with you again in the future. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. Oh, and check out Virginia Encyclopedia of Virginia. There is a new entry on Juneteenth. I wrote it, but had a lot of editorial assistance from Patty at the Virginia Humanities. So that's a resource to use as well. Thank you.
For everybody.
Holiday.